Hi, good morning again, boys and girls. Hey, some of you have lived all your life in the house you're living in right now. I spent almost my entire first years until I went away to college in the house that I started in. Now, we made some additions to it because it was only a four-room house when I was born, brought there. There was 2 rooms downstairs, 2 rooms upstairs. As the family grew, we added a couple rooms onto that house when we had it. Now, when I was born there wasn't any electricity in it. There was no running water. It was a pretty bare house in terms of that. But some of that stuff came along shortly after I was born, although we didn't get running water until I was about 10 or 11 years old, because I remember carrying water in from the pump into the house and heating it on the stove, because we had no way of heating the water except on the wood-burning stove. And then I remember when we got our bathtub. Well, there were some changes there. But some of you have lived in one house and moved to another house. Sometimes that house was bigger. Sometimes it was just in a different area. Sometimes you had to give up some friends that you had at the one place to have friends at another place. Sometimes it's hard to make moves. I've talked to some young children that it was very difficult for them to make moves. My kids were included in that. We've lived in about 6 different parsonages over the years that I've been a minister, and some of those moves were very hard for my children. They lost some friends. They made new ones, but they still felt some losses. Well, today we're talking about Jenny and Steve Saint. Now, Steve had gone back for his Aunt Rachel's funeral, back to Ecuador, into the jungle where the Wadoni Indians live. The Wadoni, and Wadoni means people. That's all their word means. They spoke of themselves as the people. And so he had gone back to the jungle. Been 30 years probably since he'd been there at that time. When his father had been killed by the Wadonis, he and his mother lived with them. They actually moved into the village where they lived and lived with them for a year. And one of the men that killed his father, in a sense, adopted him. Ccli had been a young man then. He had said, I will teach Bebe. That was the name he gave him. He didn't call him Steve, he called him Bebe. How to live well. Because he had become a Christian in a short time after he had been the one who had been responsible for killing and helping to kill all those missionaries. In any event, they lived there for a short time, about a year, and then Steve and his mother moved to another city in Ecuador where he went to school. Now, he didn't move back to the States. He moved to Quito, Ecuador, and he went to school there. They taught him Spanish. As a matter of fact, he was a citizen of Ecuador, and then eventually his mother moved back to the United States, and he lived in a couple of different places, but he settled in Florida. And it was from Florida that he went down to see his Aunt Rachel's people and for her funeral. And they said to him, if you remember, his grandma, Dawa, Ccli's mother, said to him, you must come and live among us and show us how to live well. That's how they put it. How to live well. How to follow God's trail. How to learn from God's carvings, which is what they called the Bible, God's carvings. See, they had no written language. They didn't know what it would look like to read their language. Rachel, Steve's Aunt Rachel, helped to put their language into writing, but then she had to teach them how to read too. And so they wanted him to come back and to help them to learn to read God's writings and to walk in God's trail, as well as to know how to live with that outer civilization, people who lived outside the jungle who kept coming in, sometimes taking advantage of them and things like that. Well, they said, Steve, you have to come, Babe, you have to come back and live. And he said, I don't know what to do. You know, he said, I got to go talk to my family. And so he went back and he talked to Jenny, his wife, and his kids. And the kids were excited. They wanted to come. But Steve said, it's got to be Jenny's decision. So they came back down there to the jungle and spent a short time with the Wadonis. Ginny wasn't feeling comfortable until she began to sing. She had a beautiful voice. And they were singing in their place, and the Wadani's were gathering around it, wanting to listen. And so she sang some songs. And she was singing in English, but the melody they could appreciate. And then she sang Pharaoh, Pharaoh. Well, they just went wild with that. They thought that was great. Little children thought it was great. They were jumping up and down, making their motions, having a great thing. And that changed Ginny's mind. And she said, I'm willing to come. Well, they went back up, and Steve came down with a couple of other people. They had to bring loads of equipment down because they were going out into the jungle where they'd never been. So Steve had with him something that you may have, a map. And this happens to be a map of Carlisle, of Cumberland County. He had a map of the jungle. They had never seen a map of the jungle. They had been in the jungle, but they didn't know a map. And it was a map looking from the air. Well, they'd never been up in the air, so they didn't know what that was about. They had seen the airplanes. They called them would-be's. They didn't understand them. But he said, and he pointed to the map, and they had some lines on it. And those lines were showing where the mountains were. And then there was a blue line. And he said, that's water. They said, water's not blue. Water's clear or it's brown. See, they'd never seen the ocean. So they didn't know about blue water or lakes. Their water was either muddy because of the rain, because it rained every day there, or it was clear because the mud had settled. But blue, they didn't know. But he explained where it was, and then he pointed out on the map where he wanted to build his village. And one of them said, this looks well to me. And he was pointing to a spot, and he said, I've been there. This looks well. In other words, it's a good place to build because it has good dirt. Now, if we had got good dirt, then it wouldn't wash away with the floods. And so they had to go to that. Now, you could fly there in 10 minutes, but it took many days to walk there. And so they had to take their machetes. They flew into one of the airplanes places in Shelmera and Arajuno, and then they had to walk. And they walked for days. And the jungle comes in, and they had to take their big machetes and cut the vines to walk through the jungle. And you would think, how does he know where he's going? This is a jungle. Excuse me. But he would follow. And the Wadanis are shorter than Stephen was. And so he had to duck down to get through the vines and stuff where they were going. And they would visit this village, and then they'd visit another village, until finally they would walk for almost a week. And Gobai said, this is good dirt. And Steve's looking around and saying, I don't see anything different here than I saw anyplace else. And he said, no, this is the place. And you may have, your parents may take a trip and go someplace, and they have a thing called GPS. And they punch in there where they want to go. And then the voice comes out and tells them how to get there. Well, Steve had a very simple GPS that he borrowed from another pilot. And he took it, and so he pulled this GPS out to find out where he was, because on the map it told the coordinates. That is, told them what latitude and longitude this was at. He pulled out his GPS and programmed it. That was the exact spot that the man had pointed to on the map. He said, this is the place, I see this well. How he could have found that in all that jungle, Steve could not understand, but he had found it. See, he was smart to the jungle's ways. He didn't know how to use a GPS, but he knew how to get through the jungle. Sometimes we're all smart in different ways, aren't we? Some things we can do well, and some things we can't do well. Some things others do well, we don't do well, but there are things that we can do well, and maybe others can't. And so we share our talents together. We do that as a family. Your parents have different abilities and skills, and your brothers or sisters may have different abilities and skills, but we can share them together and we can work together. Now, here was a jungle. This was where Steve was going to build his house for his family. There was nothing but jungle. So they had to build a temporary shelter, and then they had to find a place where they could put in an airstrip. They were going up there and they were looking, and they found the right spot across the river from where they were going to build their house. And they could build an airstrip and it would be big enough. So now they didn't have a house, they didn't have an airstrip. They had to hike back out again, a number of days to get back out. And Steve came back up to our country up here, where his wife and family were. And then they had to buy some equipment to get down there. You can't build a house and an airstrip with a machete. So they had to get some bigger equipment to go down there and clear that land off, because it sometimes could take over a year to clear an airstrip. They didn't have a year. What they did was they got their equipment, they got back down there, and Steve took his sons with him and some other people, and they went out into that place and they began to clear that airstrip. And in a few weeks they had it pretty well cleared. Took them a little bit longer than that. They hadn't quite finished it. They began to build a house for Ginny to live in. Now, I want to show you. This was the house they lived in back in Florida. It looks like our houses, right? Yeah, it's a pretty nice house. The way they were going to get to their house on the Wadanis was not to hike over the trail by many days, but to be able to fly there. But they had to finish the airstrip before he could fly in the plane. So they had to walk back and build it. Now, they worked on that airstrip and the plane that Steve had, that he borrowed from another guy, and they had to build it. Now, it took them a number of weeks to cut down the timber from the airstrip, to cut down the trees to build a house. But they got the house built. This is what the house looked like in the Wadani jungle. It was up off the ground. It had poles that they'd cut trees with and shaped the trees with chainsaws. They brought in 2 chainsaws to help cut the wood. And then they cut the logs to make the boards. You can see some of the boards here. That's just rough cut from the logs to make that. And on the roof, there's no shingles. There's no metal. It's a giant tarp, because that's all they could haul in. See, they didn't have a plane to haul it in. They did come in with dugout canoes and brought in the supplies that they needed to build it. And so they built this house. Well, no electricity, no kitchen, no bathroom, no washing machine, none of that stuff did they have. How in the world were they going to do this? Oh my goodness. And then came the word that Jenny and Stephanie, that's his daughter, were coming. Now the boys were already there, but they went out to get Stephanie and to bring her in. Okay, they could fly her in. They had the airport done, the airstrip done, and they flew in. He flew out, walked out and flew in with the airplane, Ginny and Stephanie. Here's Stephanie right here. This is the first time they see it. The boys have seen it. Oh my goodness, what's she going to say? Oh my goodness, what is she going to say when she sees this compared to where she was living before? And you know what she said? I'm going to tell you next week. What do you think of that? And I'm also going to tell you what this is, because this was a lifesaver for them. Not just this one, but a thing like it. Some of you may have some of these around your house, and we'll talk about that next week too. All right, now we're talking about putting up a house. And Gobai said, this is good dirt. And by that he meant that it won't wash away. It will stay there, and it will be a solid place to build your house. And what they're going to be. There's a song we sing about the wise man built his house upon the rock. There wasn't a rock there. It was a jungle, but it was good dirt. It would be a safe place to build their house. So we're going to sing that song about the wise man. The wise man built his house upon the rock. The wise man built his house upon the rock. Well, the wise man built his house upon the rock, and the rains came tumbling down. Now the rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. Well, the rains came down and the floods came up, but the house on the rock stood firm. And we could say the house on the good dirt stood firm, because it rains every day and sometimes it floods. But this house, Gobai said, this won't flood. This will be good dirt. Now, they could have been foolish and built it out on the sand dune, or on the mud swamp, in the bogs, and it wouldn't have been good. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. The foolish man built his house upon the sand. Well, the foolish man built his house upon the sands, and the rains came tumbling down. Now the rains came down and the floods came up. The rains came down and the floods came up. Well, the rains came down and the floods came up, and the house on the sands went flat. Just like that. Yeah. So, they built the house in a good, safe place, but is Jenny going to like it? Or is she not going to like it? What's going to happen? And what in the world is this all about? And we'll find out next week. Okay? Let's have a prayer. Father, thank you for this day that you've given to us, and we ask your blessing upon your children. In Jesus' name, amen. How much did we go over? Not bad?